Think Dick Cheney is a credible critic of this president?
I think the same questions could be asked of those who supported the Iraq War. You know, were they right in their predictions? Were there weapons of mass destruction there? That's what the war was sold on. Was democracy easily achievable? Was the war won in 2005 when many of these people said it was won? They didn't really, I think, understand the civil war that would break out.
Rand Paul, and by my standards, as I look at his philosophy, is basically an isolationist. That didn't work in the 1930s. It sure as heck won't work in the aftermath of 9/11, when 19 guys armed with airline tickets and box cutters came all the way from Afghanistan and killed 3,000 of our citizens.
You know, bringing up Hitler again, every time these guys, you know, get Hitler, the differences between a war we've been in and whether they go back in again.
But wait 1 second. He's bringing up 9/11 as well. We're not in Iraq because of 9/11. He's back to the same bag of tricks,
right.
Conflating the war in Iraq with a response to 9/11. WMDs, a connection with Al-Qaeda, all that disproven. You know, I'm surprised that people let him go on TV and talk this way. He's delusional. He's just
well, we're not booking him.
Although I'd like,
somebody keeps booking him. I tell you, he and Wolfowitz and a couple of these guys get regular bookings. Your thoughts, Howard? First of all, let's get to this fundamental question. It seems to me the Republican Party is now doing something it never did back in 2004, and when you had anytime Ron Paul dared to question this war in Iraq,
was practically booed off the stage.
Rudy Giuliani would jump up like a vampire and go right at him.
Well, better late than never, I guess. The Republicans are having the debate within their party that they didn't dare have in the early parts of the last decade. Dick Cheney didn't answer the questions there that were implicit in Rand Paul's critique. Rand Paul wasn't calling names. He wasn't shouting about World War II. He wasn't shouting about 9/11. He very practically said, did we understand that there'd be a civil war there? Are we safer than we were? Did the war really end in 2005? He was asking very logical, straight-ahead questions that any sensible person in either party or no party would ask. And Dick Cheney comes back with the name-calling. He comes back with, you're an isolationist, and it's just like Hitler in the 30s and 9/11. And that's not... That worked. What Dick Cheney doesn't understand, I don't think, but what a lot of Republicans, including Rand Paul, do understand, is that kind of name-calling, an easy route to political superiority that the Bush-Cheney administration used a decade ago won't work now. And it won't work even in Republican primaries. It's not going to work in the Republican primaries.
Let me try something by this. It wasn't just the ideologues, the freedom agenda people, the whole Bush crowd, the neocons and the Cheney crowd that got us in the war. It was the people who went along with them in the Republican Party, the business and Democrats too, but business Republicans, regular Republicans who just want lower taxes and less government. They all went along with that war syndrome. Why did they go along with it? Because maybe Republicans do troop along. They're more regular than Democrats. They like to follow the leader. But you tell me what's not happening now. I think Howard said it. That mentality of just follow the guys like Dick Cheney is over.
Hey, we remember what it was like a year, 2 years after 9/11. They got that war because they played on fear. They, you know, the smoking cloud being a mushroom cloud, the smoking gun being a mushroom cloud, and all that. It was fear-driven to get the public on their side. Having gotten one success at this, you get maybe one bite at this apple, and creating a disaster. Now the public at large is skeptical, and Republicans, even whether they believe it or because of politics, see that the public won't go for this again.
Why doesn't Cheney, maybe it's not in his brain soup, if you will, but why doesn't he just say, he's on these big television shows on Sunday, why doesn't he just say, you know what, I think we've got interests about Israel there, we have interests about oil. There's a lot of reasons why we don't want a feeding ground or a training ground for terrorists. Give the specifics. These are reasonable arguments. I don't agree with them all put together, but instead of just saying no, anybody who dares disagree with me is basically an appeaser.
Again, what he doesn't understand is that kind of debate is going to happen this time around. As David said, they used the fear card very successfully a decade ago. Now, if we're going to continue with this, if we are going to argue that ISIS is a real threat and so on and so forth, people are going to want to hear the real reasons. What are the reasons here? And also the nature of the Republican Party has changed, as you were pointing out. It's much more of a grassroots, primary-oriented party and less of a salute, who's next in line kind of thing. By the way, there is nobody next in line in the Republican Party, which is what gives Rand Paul and people like him a chance to really have an impact this time around.
Let's take a look at this interesting conversation point here yesterday. Senator Paul gave a personal answer to David Gregory's question on Meet the Press about the U.S. role in Iraq. This is one of those great back and forths. Listen to this.
Do you see a clear-cut American interest in Iraq? I
look at it on a personal basis. I ask, do I want to send one of my sons or your son to fight to regain Mosul? And I think, well, yeah, these are nasty terrorists. Shouldn't we want to kill them? But I think, who should want to stop them more? Maybe the people who live there. Should not the Shiites, the Maliki government, should they not stand up? And if they're ripping their uniforms off and fleeing, if they don't think Mosul's worth saving, how am I going to convince my son or your son to die for Mosul? I know they're bad terrorists, and yes, we should prevent them from exporting terror, but I'm not so sure where the clear-cut American interest is.
Pretty sound response. Good question, too.
Good question, good answer. It's a populist response. It's at the local level. It's not about, these grand ideas about remaking the Middle East and these very theoretical abstractions that the neocons and others pushed for years. It's like, do you want your son, to die for this? We lost 4,500 American men and women, over 100,000, maybe over 200,000 dead Iraqis. There's a real exhaustion. We've seen the cost for this exercise to go in led by people who would say there's no reason to worry about sectarian warfare.
It's funny that Dick Cheney never asked this question about himself.
No, he never.
Cheney during the Vietnam War, which he supported, he had 5 deferments. In other words, he didn't let that question come to him.
I think there's a basic divide here between people who see war and foreign policy as like a giant chessboard to move around the pieces, and I usually don't agree with Rand Paul, but those who see it in human costs and advantages. And that's what we're seeing here. Dick Cheney will never talk about what you paid to get what you got in Iraq.
He never really talked about the people in hospitals right now either.
But it's not a question of exhaustion. This isn't really about, to me, it's not about the American people's discussed with 10 years of war there. The question now is, what rationale is there for what we want to do? I think the American people would be willing to accept some level of involvement in an international context if it were honestly explained to them what the heck is at stake here. Now, when the president himself says we're not going to play whack-a-mole in the region, frankly, that isn't that helpful either. What are we about here? Let's have a real discussion of it. We never really had it in a broad-based way a decade ago. Now is the time. Now is the time if we're going to do anything long range in that region. And Cheney wants to short circuit that debate. And I think Rand Paul, to his credit, wants to have it be a centerpiece of his own candidacy, which is a heck of a no.
I like a lot of you guys. I went home this weekend thinking the whole weekend, what would I do if I could call the shots? It's a tough one.
Well, yeah.
First of all, Maliki knows what he's doing. He's getting in bed with the Shia and with Iran.
He knows his own
and the Sunnis tend to be going over with this ISIS group because they're basically acting in a sectarian fashion. They're going to their people.
People are following their own interests.
We don't have an interest in that fight.
And we keep talking about pressuring Maliki to get something more inclusive while there are Shia clerics sending tens of thousands of volunteers to the front. And he's taken no steps. I mean, what leverage we have when he can turn to Iran is sort of a big open question. But to get to your point that you made a second ago, it's not just what Howard said, what the American public would be willing to do. You have to be able to show them that there is something that can be done that has a connection to a possible positive outcome.
And by the way, this is whether he likes it or not, even though it wasn't his war to begin with. For better or worse, the president has to explain this. He has to ignore that. He has to ignore that noise from Cheney and speak directly to the American people. If there is some interest we need to pursue here, he's got to
explain why there isn't.
Or explain why there isn't.
It wouldn't hurt him to do what they used to do in the 60s. Stand in front of a map and point to the map and say, here's what's going on over there.
Yeah.
That would be a start. My question is this question of, if we get over there as advisors, which we get 300 guys now over there now, and the Shia militias start massacring people, it'll be like Sabra and Shatila again. We'll be responsible.
Yeah.
Well, by the way, when I hear the term advisors, you and I are old enough to remember.
You're there.
Advisors a generation
ago. Are they in the field when they're fighting, advisors?
Well,
or they stay back at the barracks?
They're not supposed to be. We'll see what happens. If they start no, there is the possibility.
How do you advise if you don't go with the fighting?
Listen, unlike, I think, Johnson or even Kennedy, I think Obama, having had the lesson of Vietnam, doesn't want us to get involved in the actual shooting there, because we'll end up shooting Sunnis who aren't part of ISIS.
Of course.
Because it's all going to be...
And then the Sunnis will hate us now.
Yes.
Thank you, Howard. This has been a rambunctious discussion, because I think we're all very much upset about the situation we're in right now. Thank you, Howard, and thank you, David. Coming up,